May 15th, 1943. The rhythmic clatter of steel wheels against iron rails had become the soundtrack of Werner Hartmann's existence for 72 hours straight. His reflection stared back at him from the train window, ghostly and unfamiliar. 20 years old, though he felt ancient. The face looking back bore little resemblance to the enthusiastic recruit who'd left Hamburg 2 years earlier, convinced he was marching toward glory and the fulfillment of destiny itself. Beyond his reflection, America unfolded in ways that made his brain hurt trying to reconcile what he saw with what he'd been told. They'd left Camp Shanks 3 days ago, a sprawling processing facility in New York where the first cracks in his worldview had begun to appear. The abundance had started there, real beds with clean sheets, showers with hot water that didn't run out, food served on actual plates, not dumped into mess tins like slop for animals. The landscape outside transformed with each passing hour. First, the industrial cities of the East Coast, factories belching smoke, proof of manufacturing capacity that seemed impossible for a nation the propaganda ministry had described as decadent and weak. Then rolling farmland, fields so vast he couldn't see their edges, tractors moving through them like toys in the distance. Towns appeared and disappeared, each with paved streets and electric lights, automobiles parked casually as if everyone owned one, as if metal and rubber and gasoline were infinite resources available to common people. Now they were somewhere in Texas, or so the guards had told them. The land had flattened into something primordial and harsh, reminding him of North Africa, but wrong somehow, different in ways he couldn't articulate. The vegetation was strange, the colours were wrong. The sky seemed bigger here, stretched taut like canvas over the earth. The train began its slow deceleration, brakes hissing and groaning. Through the window, a small station materialised from the heat shimmer. A weathered sign read Amarillo. The platform was nearly empty, just a few locals going about their business, not even bothering to watch the train full of enemy soldiers rolling through their town. That casual indifference spoke volumes about American confidence, their absolute certainty that these 500 prisoners posed no threat whatsoever. Then Werner saw him. Standing near the edge of the platform, one boot propped against a post, a man who looked like he'd stepped directly from one of those American films that had been grudgingly admitted were excellent entertainment, even if they represented cultural degeneracy. Leather chaps worn smooth and dark with age, denim shirt faded nearly white, a hat with a brim wide enough to cast his entire face in shadow. The man was rolling a cigarette with practiced ease, fingers moving through the ritual without conscious thought, eyes squinting against the brilliant sunlight as he watched the train pass. A real cowboy. Not an illustration from a propaganda poster mocking American primitivism, not an actor performing for cameras, an actual working cowboy, standing on a train platform in Texas, existing as casually and undeniably as the wooden boards beneath his boots. Werner pressed his face harder against the glass, trying to absorb every detail before the train carried him past. The cowboy finished rolling his cigarette, struck a match against his boot heel, and lit it. Smoke curled up past the brim of his hat. He met Werner's eyes for just a moment, a brief connection between captor-nation and captive, then looked away as if German prisoners of war were the least interesting thing he'd seen that day. Around Werner, his fellow prisoners stirred and muttered. 500 men packed into railway cars, still wearing the remnants of Afrika Korps uniforms, though most had been issued American clothing by now. Trousers that actually fit, shirts without holes, boots that didn't leak. They were mostly young, mostly scared beneath their attempts at military bearing, mostly trying to make sense of an experience that contradicted everything they'd been prepared for. Friedrich Becker sat across from Werner, a Unteroffizier who'd fought at Kasserine Pass and lived to talk about it, though he rarely did. He was staring out his own window, jaw working silently, processing the same impossible observations. Next to him, Wilhelm Müller dozed fitfully, head bobbing with the train's motion. Müller had been captured near Tunis, had watched his entire unit surrender when the ammunition ran out and the water was gone and the choice was captivity or death in the desert. They'd all expected to die in Africa. Different circumstances, different locations, but the same fundamental understanding that their war would end in sand and blood. The desert fox himself, Rommel, had seemed invincible for a while, a tactical genius making the impossible look routine. But genius can't manufacture fuel that doesn't exist or summon reinforcements that never arrive. The Africa Corps had been magnificent and doomed, and these 500 men were the remnants, the survivors who'd lived long enough to become someone else's problem. The propaganda had been specific about what awaited them in American captivity. Barbarism, torture, the machinery of a nation without culture or honor would grind them into dust. Americans were soft and decadent, yes, but also cruel in their softness, vindictive in their weakness. A mongrel nation of mixed races and competing interests, held together only by greed and primitive materialism, would naturally treat prisoners like animals. After all, Americans were cowboys and gangsters, playing at civilization while remaining fundamentally uncivilized. The first shock had come on the transport ships, massive vessels that crossed the Atlantic with contemptuous ease, as if German U-boats were minor inconveniences rather than mortal threats. The food had arrived 3 times daily, hot and plentiful. White bread made from real wheat flour, not the sawdust and substitutes that had become standard in Germany. Coffee that was actually coffee, bitter and strong and real. Meat at every meal. Portions that would have fed 2 men comfortably back home, served to each prisoner as if food were too abundant to ration carefully. They'd looked at each other in confusion and suspicion. Was this a trick? Some psychological operation designed to soften them up before the real torture began? But days passed, then weeks, and the food kept coming. The same rations American soldiers received, as required by the Geneva Convention that Americans apparently took seriously, treating it as actual law rather than suggestions to be ignored when convenient. Werner had gained weight on the voyage. Most of them had. After months of hunger in the desert, their bodies had responded to adequate nutrition with desperate efficiency. Some men had gotten sick from eating too much too quickly, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against the sudden abundance. The ship's doctor, an American lieutenant who spoke decent German, had treated them with antibiotics that worked like magic, making infections disappear in days that would have killed men a decade earlier. Now, as the train carried them deeper into Texas, the contradictions compounded with each passing mile. Through the windows, they saw industrial farming on a scale that seemed impossible. Fields that went to the horizon and beyond, with equipment moving through them that must have cost more than entire villages. Herds of cattle numbering in the thousands, grazing on open range that stretched forever. Oil derricks dotting the landscape like metal trees, pumping wealth from the ground, turning Texas crude into gasoline that powered the vehicles they saw everywhere, driven by ordinary people going about ordinary business. Towns appeared regularly, each with paved roads and electric lights burning even in daylight, power so cheap that conservation was unnecessary. Businesses with signs advertising goods and services, suggesting an economy that functioned, that grew, that produced and consumed and continued despite the global war consuming millions of lives and entire national budgets. Houses with automobiles parked outside, sometimes 2 or 3 per family, suggesting wealth distributed so widely that even common labourers owned machines that represented months of wages back home. A prisoner named Johann Kramer, who'd been a mechanic in Hamburg before the war, kept a running count of the vehicles he saw. He'd stopped counting at 3,000, his mind refusing to accept the implications of that number. How many factories did it take to produce 3,000 automobiles? How much steel and rubber and glass? How many workers earning wages sufficient to buy them? The industrial capacity implied by casual automotive abundance was staggering, terrifying, impossible to reconcile with the image of America as a paper tiger, all appearance and no substance. "This can't be real," Kremer muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They're staging this somehow, moving the same cars around to impress us. It's a show. But even he didn't believe it. You can't fake this much, this consistently, across this much distance. The American heartland was real, and it was everything the propaganda had insisted didn't exist. One prisoner, an older man named Ernst Weber, who'd been a teacher before the war, began writing observations in a small notebook the Americans had given him. Not a diary exactly, nothing that could be construed as intelligence gathering, just thoughts and impressions. He wrote, "The Americans have so much of everything. They don't just have abundance, they've made abundance normal, expected, the default condition of existence. And they share it even with their enemies, as if generosity costs them nothing, because nothing really costs them anything. We've been fighting a nation that treats its prisoners of war better than Germany treats its own soldiers. What does that say about everything we were told?" The train slowed again, this time for a longer stop. A small station with a water tower and not much else. Guards opened the doors to let fresh air circulate, and the heat hit them like a physical force. Texas in late spring was already brutal, the sun white and merciless in a sky bleached of colour. The air smelled of dust and distance and something wild and empty. More cowboys appeared here, locals curious about the trainload of Germans passing through. They looked at the prisoners with mild interest, the way one might observe exotic animals at a zoo, interesting but not threatening. A woman emerged from the station carrying a basket of bread and offered it to the American guards, who accepted with easy familiarity. Small-town hospitality extended even to guards watching over enemy soldiers. The guards distributed the bread to the prisoners without comment, as if this were normal, expected, the way things were done. The bread was still warm, freshly baked that morning, probably in someone's kitchen, given freely to strangers who happened to be enemies. Werner held his peace and tried to understand the mindset that produced such gestures. Where he came from, food was controlled, rationed, distributed by authority, and consumed according to rules. Here, apparently, someone could just bake extra bread and give it to whoever seemed hungry, trusting that there would be more flour tomorrow, that the oven would still work, that the world would continue providing because it always had. Hours passed. The landscape gradually shifted from flat prairie to something more varied, small hills and stands of trees appearing, suggesting different terrain ahead. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the train car into an oven. Men dozed in the heat, conserving energy, waiting for whatever came next with the patience soldiers learn when they have no control over their circumstances. Evening approached as the train made its final approach to their destination. Through the windows, they could see buildings in the distance, arranged in orderly rows, surrounded by fencing. Camp Hearn, 30 miles northwest of Houston, built to hold 4,800 prisoners, though currently housing only about 3,000. Their group of 500 would help fill it closer to capacity. The train shuddered to a halt. Guards shouted orders in English and broken German, organizing the mass of men into formations. They filed out into the dying light, boots hitting gravel, eyes adjusting to the space after 3 days in confinement. Buses waited, American-made, painted olive drab, engines idling patiently. The ride from the station to the camp was short, maybe 20 minutes through countryside that looked like it had been farmland before the government requisitioned it for the duration. Cotton fields stretched away in the dusk, plants just beginning to grow, promising a harvest that would need hands to pick it. The buses turned onto a road leading to the main gate, and the prisoners tensed, expecting the visual representation of captivity. Machine gun towers, searchlights, barbed wire coils, guards with dogs trained to tear flesh. Instead, they found something that looked disconcertingly like a military base, organized and functional, but not overtly hostile. Guard towers, yes, but the soldiers in them looked bored rather than menacing. Fencing, certainly, but no more imposing than what surrounded any secure facility. No dogs, no obvious weapons pointed inward. The gate swung open, and the buses rolled through into what appeared to be a small, purpose-built town. Barracks arranged in neat rows, each painted the same utilitarian colour, each with windows and doors that suggested human habitation rather than warehousing. Paths between buildings made of crushed gravel, maintained and clear. Electric lights already beginning to glow as darkness approached. A mess hall large enough to feed hundreds. Recreation buildings, an infirmary, administration offices. It looked like a military camp because that's exactly what it was, just one where everyone was a prisoner. The buses stopped near a large open area where formations could assemble. The prisoners filed out again, automatically arranging themselves into military order because that's what soldiers do, creating structure from chaos by habit and training. American officers appeared, along with translators, men who spoke German with various accents, some native speakers who'd immigrated before the war, some academics who'd studied the language, some whose German had the peculiar flat quality of those who'd learned it from books rather than conversation. The camp commander was a colonel named Robert Harrison, a career officer with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor work. He stood before them with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for silence to fall naturally rather than demanding it. When he spoke, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact, the tone of someone explaining procedures rather than issuing threats. The translator, a German-American named Friedrich Schmidt, who'd left Munich in 1936 and now wore an American uniform, rendered the colonel's words with careful precision. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. The United States of America takes its obligations under that convention seriously. You will be treated according to international law. The rules here are simple and non-negotiable. You will work 8 hours per day, 6 days per week, performing agricultural labour necessary to the war effort. You will follow all regulations and instructions given by camp authorities. You will cause no trouble, commit no violence, and make no attempt to escape. In return for compliance, you will receive 3 substantial meals daily, the same rations provided to American soldiers. You will receive wages of 80 cents per day, paid in camp scrip that can be used at the canteen for personal items. You will have access to mail services, both sending and receiving letters from home. You will have recreation time, religious services, and access to medical care equal to that provided to American servicemen. Treat us with respect, and you will receive respect in return. Cause problems, and you will face disciplinary action. The choice is entirely yours." 500 men stood in the gathering darkness, trying to process what they'd just heard. Wages? They were going to be paid to work? The same 80 cents per day that American privates earned, which worked out to roughly $50 per month in real money. For prisoners of war. The concept seemed absurd, contradictory to the fundamental nature of captivity. Prisoners aren't paid, they're forced to work. That's what being a prisoner means. Friedrich Becker, standing in formation with his mouth slightly open, couldn't reconcile the words with reality. He'd been an Unteroffizier, a sergeant, someone who understood military hierarchy and the treatment of captives. When German forces took prisoners, they worked them until they dropped, fed them enough to keep them alive, and expected nothing but obedience and labour. The idea that captors would pay their prisoners, would offer them wages like employees rather than slaves, seemed like either a cruel joke or evidence of American insanity. But the colonel's expression suggested no humour, no deception, just statement of fact. This was the system. These were the rules. Accept them and benefit. Resist and suffer. Choose. That night, they were assigned to barracks and given time to settle in. Each building housed 50 men in double-decker bunks arranged along the walls. Electric lights overhead, switched controlled near the door, allowing them to create darkness when they wanted to sleep. The barracks had electricity, indoor plumbing, flush toilets, hot showers, things that many of them hadn't experienced in their own homes in Germany, where old buildings and limited infrastructure meant cold water and outhouses were still common in rural areas. Wilhelm Müller stood under the hot shower for 20 minutes, letting water sluice away 3 days of train travel and months of accumulated psychological grime. The soap was real soap, not the synthetic substitute that barely lathered. The water pressure was strong and consistent, suggesting infrastructure that worked, that was maintained, that functioned as designed. He closed his eyes and let the heat work into his muscles and tried not to think about his family in Dresden, living in an apartment where hot water was a luxury available once a week if the building's ancient boiler decided to cooperate. Dinner that first night was served in shifts, the mess hall too small to accommodate everyone at once. The prisoners lined up with metal trays, moving through a serving line where American soldiers and German prisoners working kitchen duty ladled food onto plates. The portions were substantial. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, coffee, and pie for dessert. Actual pie, made with real sugar and fruit, and served as if dessert were a standard component of meals rather than a distant memory of peacetime. Werner sat with his group and ate slowly, savouring each bite, still half convinced that this was temporary, that tomorrow would bring the barbarism they'd been promised. Around him, 500 men ate in relative silence, the only sounds being utensils against trays and occasional quiet conversations. No one complained about the food. How could they? It was better than what most of them had eaten in months, possibly years. After dinner, they were allowed free time before lights out. Some men wrote letters home, using paper and pencils provided by the camp. Others explored the rec hall, finding board games and books and comfortable chairs. A radio played American music, big band sound and swing jazz, the soundtrack of a nation at war that still had energy left over for entertainment. Some prisoners sat and listened, trying to understand lyrics in a language most of them didn't speak, absorbing the rhythm and energy of music that sounded nothing like the martial anthems and folk songs they'd grown up with. Sleep came easier than expected that first night. The bunks were comfortable, the barracks' temperature controlled by open windows and fans, the darkness complete when the lights were switched off. Outside, guards patrolled with flashlights, but quietly, not making a show of vigilance. Inside, exhausted men found rest in enemy territory that treated them better than home ever had. The next morning arrived with a bell at 6, loud and insistent, but not harsh. Men stirred and groaned and pulled on work clothes provided by the camp, denim trousers, cotton shirts, work boots that actually fit properly. Breakfast was eggs, sausage, toast, coffee, orange juice. More food than necessary, served as if abundance were normal. After breakfast, they assembled in the yard where they'd arrived the night before. American civilians had joined the military personnel, men in worn denim and leather boots, weathered faces and calloused hands, men who looked like they'd spent their lives working under the sun. These were the ranchers and farmers who needed labour, who'd driven here before dawn to collect their allotment of German workers. One man stood out from the rest, not because he was different, but because he was archetypal, the perfect representation of everything Werner had seen through train windows. His name was John Davidson, owner of a cotton farm several thousand acres in size, a man who'd built his operation from nothing over 30 years of brutal work and careful management. He needed 40 men for his fields, and he'd arrived early to get first choice of the new arrivals. Davidson walked slowly along the formation, eyes assessing with the practiced judgment of someone who'd hired hundreds of workers over the decades. He pointed at the biggest, strongest-looking Germans, men who appeared capable of the physical demands of cotton picking. He counted out his 40, pointing and nodding, efficient and businesslike. The selected men stepped forward, resigned to whatever came next, expecting to be herded like livestock onto trucks and driven to labour that would break their backs and spirits. Instead, Davidson did something that stopped time. He walked directly to the first man he'd selected, a tall prisoner named Klaus Richter, who'd been a factory worker before the war. Davidson stood before him, extended his right hand, and spoke in English that the translator rendered into German. In Texas, men shake hands before working together. It's how we do things here. Shows mutual respect between employer and employee. Klaus stared at the extended hand as if it were a snake that might strike. 6 months ago, he'd been shooting at Americans in Tunisia, trying to kill them before they killed him, fighting in a war that seemed eternal and unwinnable. Now one of them wanted to shake his hand like an equal, like a partner, like someone whose dignity and worth were automatically assumed rather than denied. The moment stretched. Every eye in the formation watched to see what would happen. Would Klaus refuse? Would he accept? What did it mean to shake hands with your enemy, to participate in a ritual that implied equality and mutual respect? Klaus extended his own hand, hesitantly, as if expecting Davidson to withdraw it at the last second, revealing the gesture as mockery. But Davidson's hand met his, grip firm and calloused, the handshake of a working man to a working man, no difference in status or worth, just two people preparing to labour together toward a common goal. Davidson went down the line, shaking hands with each of his 40 Germans, repeating his name, asking theirs through the translator, treating them as individuals rather than interchangeable units of labour. Some prisoners gripped his hand firmly, accepting the gesture in the spirit offered. Others barely touched it, still suspicious, still waiting for the trick to reveal itself. But Davidson didn't waver, treating each man identically, with simple human courtesy that cost him nothing but meant everything. Trucks waited to transport workers to their various destinations. The 40 Germans, selected by Davidson, climbed into the back of 2 flatbed trucks, sitting on wooden benches as the vehicles rumbled out through the camp gates and onto country roads. The sun was already climbing, promising brutal heat by midday. The landscape rolled past, cotton fields prepared for planting, farmhouses in the distance, windmills turning slowly in the morning breeze. Davidson's farm was 15 miles from the camp, a sprawling operation that looked more like a small town than a single enterprise. A main house, several barns, equipment sheds, workers' quarters, a commissary, even a small store. The cotton fields stretched to the horizon in every direction, thousands of acres of rich Texas soil that would produce thousands of bales if properly tended. The Germans were shown to a barracks specifically built for seasonal workers, a long building with bunks and lockers, simple but clean, with running water and electricity. Davidson's foreman, a weathered Mexican-American named Carlos Mendez, who'd worked this farm for 20 years, explained through the translator what would be expected: work from sunup to mid-afternoon, 6 days per week, Sundays off. Show up on time, work hard, don't cause trouble. In return, wages paid weekly, 3 meals daily provided at the commissary, all the water you could drink, medical care if needed. The first day in the fields was revelation and torture in equal measure. The cotton plants were young, not ready for harvest yet, so the work involved weeding, thinning, maintenance tasks that required bent backs and constant movement under the relentless sun. The heat was crushing, dry and merciless, turning the air itself into a physical burden that pressed down on shoulders and necks. But they weren't alone in the fields. Mexican migrant workers moved through adjacent rows, families and individuals who followed the harvests north from the border, seeking work that paid cash and asked few questions. Black sharecroppers worked nearby, men and women whose families had worked this land for generations under various systems of exploitation, people whose skin marked them as inferior in the social hierarchy that governed Texas and the South. Poor white tenant farmers were there too, landless and desperate, working for wages that barely sustained life, dreams of ownership and prosperity, long since abandoned to the reality of backbreaking labour and perpetual debt. The racial and social hierarchy that defined Southern society played out in these fields, complex and brutal and mostly invisible to outsiders who didn't understand its unwritten rules. The Germans fit nowhere in this hierarchy. They weren't white in the sense that mattered here, despite their skin colour. They weren't black or brown. They weren't migrant or sharecropper or tenant farmer. They were something else entirely. Enemy soldiers doing agricultural labour in a system that had no precedent for their existence. And in that undefined space, something extraordinary happened. The hierarchy collapsed under the weight of shared suffering. Everyone sweated the same in the Texas heat. Everyone's back ached the same after hours of bent labour. Everyone's hands got the same cuts and blisters from working with tools and plants. Everyone drank from the same water buckets that appeared regularly, brought by workers whose job was to ensure no one died of dehydration. At noon, a bell rang across the fields. Work stopped immediately, everyone straightening with groans and stretches, moving toward the commissary where lunch waited. The Germans expected bread and water, basic sustenance to fuel more work. Instead, they found a spread that would have qualified as Sunday dinner back home: beef stew with chunks of actual meat, cornbread still warm from the oven, sweet tea in massive pitchers, apple pie for dessert. The woman serving food was named Rosa Martinez, a grandmother who'd been cooking for Davidson's workers for 15 years. She spoke no German. The Germans spoke no Spanish. But she smiled at each man as he came through the line, ladling generous portions onto plates, adding extra when she thought someone looked particularly hungry, treating them with the same kindness she showed everyone else who worked these fields. Food is a universal language, and Rosa's cooking spoke of care and tradition, and someone's genuine effort to nourish bodies being destroyed by labour. Werner Hartmann would remember that meal for the rest of his life, not because the food was exceptional, though it was good, but because a Mexican woman treated German prisoners with the same humanity she showed everyone else. The Third Reich had insisted this was impossible, that racial hierarchies were natural and necessary, that certain people were inherently inferior and others inherently superior. The Third Reich was wrong, provably and undeniably wrong, demonstrated by an elderly grandmother who'd never heard of Nazi ideology and wouldn't have cared if she had. Days became weeks. The Germans settled into routines of work and rest, their bodies adapting to the demands of agricultural labour, their minds slowly recalibrating to a reality that contradicted everything they'd believed. The work was genuinely hard, no question. 8 hours in the Texas heat would break anyone who wasn't prepared for it. But it wasn't cruel. It wasn't designed to destroy them. It was just work, the same work that everyone else did, with the same breaks and the same compensation and the same acknowledgement that workers were human beings who needed rest and food and basic dignity. The wages accumulated in camp accounts, 80 cents daily, adding up to substantial sums over time. The canteen sold personal items: cigarettes, candy, writing paper, soap, small luxuries that made life more comfortable. Some prisoners spent their money freely, enjoying pleasures long denied. Others saved obsessively, planning for an uncertain future, accumulating funds that might mean survival when they eventually returned to Germany. Saturday nights brought a different kind of revelation. The work week ended and the camp recreation hall filled with men seeking entertainment and distraction. American music played on the radio, Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys broadcasting their Western swing sound, a uniquely American fusion of country, jazz, and big band that existed nowhere else in the world. The music was infectious, impossible to ignore, rhythms that made feet tap and bodies sway even when minds resisted. Prisoners with musical backgrounds formed bands, using instruments provided by the camp administration. They started with German folk songs and marches, familiar material that connected them to home. But gradually, inevitably, American influences crept in. Western swing rhythms merged with German melodies. Jazz harmonies coloured traditional songs. A new hybrid emerged, music that belonged to neither culture fully but contained elements of both, created by men caught between worlds, trying to make sense of their experience through sound. After Italy switched sides in September 1943, Italian POWs gained additional freedoms, including carefully supervised attendance at local dances and social events. The Germans watched with envy and resentment, seeing enemy prisoners treated as potential friends while they remained firmly behind fences. But even for Germans, small allowances appeared. Occasional permission to attend church services in nearby towns at Christmas and Easter, always chaperoned, always supervised, but still representing a slice of normalcy in an abnormal situation. The letters home created their own crisis of conscience. What could they write? How could they describe this experience to families suffering through Allied bombing campaigns that turned cities into rubble? To mothers standing in endless ration lines hoping for bread? To wives who hadn't seen meat in months and didn't expect to anytime soon? Friedrich Becker wrote to his wife in Hamburg, carefully crafting sentences that would pass through censors on both sides, trying to convey truth without seeming to betray his country or break his wife's spirit. The Americans are not what we were told. They have given us warm clothes and good boots. We work hard but are treated fairly. The food is adequate. I am saving my wages so that when I come home, we will have money to rebuild our life together. I think of you constantly and pray for your safety. This war will end someday, and we will be together again. He didn't mention the abundance that surrounded him on all sides, the casual wealth displayed even in small rural towns, the stores packed with goods that people bought without apparent concern for scarcity. He didn't describe the 3 meals daily with meat and vegetables and dessert, the hot showers and clean clothing, the medical care that actually healed injuries and infections. He didn't explain that he'd gained 20 pounds and felt healthier than he had in years. How could he? She wouldn't believe him. The censors wouldn't allow it. And even if they did, what purpose would it serve except to deepen her despair about conditions at home? His wife's letters back, when they arrived weeks or months later, painted a different picture entirely. Hamburg was dying under constant bombing. Food was scarce. Fuel was gone. People burned furniture to stay warm. The black market was the only market that functioned, and prices were astronomical. Everyone lived in fear of the air raid sirens, of the bombers that came at night, of the fires that consumed entire neighbourhoods. She tried to sound cheerful and hopeful in her writing, but the truth bled through her words like blood through bandages. Reading those letters, sitting in his comfortable bunk in an electrified barracks after a filling meal, Friedrich felt a guilt so profound it became physical pain. He was safe and well-fed while his wife starved and hid from bombs. He was comfortable while Germany burned. He was thriving in captivity while his nation died in its defence. The contradiction was unbearable, and yet there was nothing he could do about it except continue working, continue surviving, continue existing in this strange limbo between worlds. Camp McLean, near Amarillo, offered different experiences but similar transformations. The Germans sent there found themselves working not in cotton fields, but on cattle ranches, sprawling operations that covered hundreds of thousands of acres of open range. These weren't the metaphorical cowboys of propaganda posters. They were the real thing. Hard men doing dangerous work in an unforgiving environment, tending animals that could kill carelessly, living by codes of behaviour that predated the war by centuries. The rancher who employed most of them was named Thomas Anderson, a third-generation Texan whose grandfather had driven cattle up the Chisholm Trail when Indians still controlled much of the territory. Anderson surveyed the Germans assigned to his ranch with obvious scepticism. Luftwaffe pilots, panzer crews, U-boat sailors. Not one had ever seen a cow up close, much less knew how to work with thousands of them across terrain that could kill the unprepared. He sighed deeply and began from the absolute beginning. How to approach a horse without startling it, how to hold a rope properly, how to mount and dismount, how not to get kicked, bitten or trampled by animals that outweighed humans by half a ton and had temperaments ranging from docile to actively murderous. The Germans were terrified of the animals. The animals were suspicious of the Germans. It was mutual distrust at first sight, prey animals recognizing predators even when those predators posed no actual threat. But Anderson was patient in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. His own son was flying B-17 bombers over Germany at that very moment, dropping the bombs that were destroying cities and killing civilians and military alike. These boys in front of him were someone's sons too, enemy or not. They were here. They needed to work. Cattle didn't care about politics or nationality. A cow that needed doctoring didn't give a damn whether the hand holding the medicine spoke German or English or Swahili. Within weeks, something unexpected happened. The Germans took to ranching with an enthusiasm and aptitude that shocked everyone. Maybe it was their military discipline translating well to the structured routines of cattle work. Maybe it was their engineering minds appreciating the complex logistics of moving thousands of animals across vast distances. Maybe it was just that working with animals was honest in a way that war had never been, requiring skill and courage and patience, but not requiring hate or killing or the destruction of everything beautiful in the world. One Hauptmann named Erich Schmidt became Anderson's best horseman within 2 months. He could rope and brand and doctor cattle with the best of Anderson's permanent crew, men who'd been doing this work their entire lives. Schmidt rode like he'd been born in a saddle, moving with the horse rather than fighting it, understanding instinctively how to work with the animal's nature rather than against it. At night, after work, he sketched the landscape in a notebook. Mesas at sunset, painted with colours that seemed impossible but were merely Texas being Texas. Longhorns silhouetted against enormous skies, cowboys and Germans working side by side in images that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world in 1943. Anderson and Schmidt developed a working relationship that gradually became something more, a cautious friendship built on mutual respect and shared labour. They didn't discuss the war or politics or why Schmidt's nation had invaded Poland or why Anderson's son was bombing German cities. They talked about cattle and weather and the price of beef and whether that particular bull was going to be trouble during breeding season. They talked like ranchers talk, in specifics and practicalities, in the language of men who work with their hands and measure success in tangible outcomes. Sunday mornings brought religious services within the camps, organised by the prisoners themselves with American approval and support. Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests among the POWs led worship using hymnals and religious materials provided by the military. Freedom of religion extended even to enemies, as if the First Amendment applied regardless of nationality or allegiance. Some camps arranged special permits allowing small groups of prisoners to attend local churches on major holidays, always supervised, always controlled, but still representing an acknowledgement of spiritual needs that transcended captivity. Christmas, 1944, brought a moment that few men present would ever forget. A dozen German prisoners sat in the back pews of a small Baptist church in Amarillo, invited by the congregation to share in the holiday service. The language barrier was absolute. The Germans understood almost nothing being said from the pulpit. But then the choir began singing, and the melody was universal and familiar. Silent Night, Stille Nacht. Written by an Austrian priest more than a century earlier, it had become the Christmas hymn transcending all borders and conflicts. The Germans knew every word in their own language. By the second verse, they were singing softly in German, while the Americans sang in English, 2 languages and 1 melody, harmonizing in a small Texas church while the world burned. By the third verse, some of the Germans were crying openly, tears running down faces weathered by sun and wind and war. Not from sadness exactly, though there was sadness in it. Not from loneliness, though they were impossibly far from home. They cried from the shock of being treated as human beings in an enemy land, of being invited to worship in a church that had no reason to welcome them, of being reminded that they were more than soldiers or prisoners, that they were men with souls who needed connection to something larger than themselves. The congregation saw those tears and understood, at least partially. These were boys far from home during a holiday meant for family and warmth and peace. Enemy or not, they were human, and on Christmas that had to count for something. After the service, elderly women pressed cookies into German hands, homemade treats wrapped in napkins, given with smiles and nods that needed no translation. The cookies were delicious and unnecessary and perfect, small gestures of kindness that demonstrated the American capacity for generosity, even toward those who'd fought against them. December 23rd, 1944. Camp Papago Park, Arizona. While most prisoners adapted to captivity with varying degrees of acceptance, some refused to accept their circumstances. 25 U-boat sailors, led by several officers, including Kapitänleutnant Jürgen Wattenberg, had been planning an escape for 3 months. Their tunnel stretched 178 feet beyond the camp fence, dug painstakingly with improvised tools, concealed carefully from guards who couldn't imagine anyone would want to escape from conditions this comfortable. The plan was brilliant in conception and catastrophically stupid in execution. They would emerge beyond the fence, make their way to the Salt River, and float down it to Mexico using a collapsible boat they'd built from scrap materials. From Mexico, they would somehow make their way back to Germany and continue fighting. It was a plan that required extraordinary courage and optimism and a fundamental misunderstanding of Arizona geography. At midnight, they made their move. One by one, they crawled through the tunnel, emerging into the Arizona desert under a full moon. Freedom. 25 men spread out and began running toward the Salt River, following maps they'd studied obsessively, confident in their navigation and planning. They reached the riverbank and stopped, confusion turning rapidly to horror. The Salt River was completely dry. Not a drop of water. Just sand and rocks and occasional vegetation marking where water once flowed before dams and irrigation projects diverted it elsewhere. Their maps were from 1880, copied from an old atlas in the camp library, created before extensive water control projects reshaped Arizona's hydrology. Their boat was useless. Their plan was dead. Panic set in. They scattered into the desert, some alone, some in pairs, all equally unprepared for survival in terrain that was freezing at night and scorching during the day. They had minimal water, insufficient food, no real understanding of the distances involved or the dangers of desert travel. Within hours, most were hopelessly lost. The Arizona desert in late December is a brutal environment for the unprepared. Nighttime temperatures drop below freezing. Daytime temperatures can reach 70 degrees. Dehydration happens fast, disorientation faster. The landscape looks the same in every direction, no landmarks, no way to gauge distance, just endless rocks and cacti and soil that offers no mercy to those who don't respect it. One Unteroffizier named Johann Kremer stumbled into a gas station near Phoenix after 3 days of wandering. He was sunburned to the point of blistering, dehydrated to the edge of organ failure, hallucinating intermittently. The attendant, an elderly man named Pete Randolph, who'd run this station for 20 years, took one look at him and knew something was seriously wrong. Pete sat Kremer down in the shade, gave him water in small sips to avoid shock, and made him a sandwich from the small kitchen he maintained for himself. Then he called the authorities to report a possible escaped prisoner, because that was the law and Pete believed in following laws. While they waited for sheriff's deputies to arrive, Pete shared his coffee and told Kremer about his own son, who was fighting in the Pacific, who'd been gone for 2 years with no end in sight, who sent letters describing islands where the jungle tried to kill you as efficiently as the enemy. 2 fathers' sons, Pete explained through gestures and the few words they shared. One lost in the Arizona desert, one lost on Japanese-held islands. Both caught in a war neither asked for, both doing what they thought was duty, both wanting nothing more than to go home and resume normal lives. The human element transcended the political element, at least for those few minutes in a gas station outside Phoenix. Kapitänleutnant Wattenberg made it the farthest, all the way to downtown Phoenix, where he wandered the streets for several days before exhaustion and desperation caught up with him. A street cleaner noticed him sitting on Van Buren Street on January 28th, looking dazed and confused, and struck up a conversation that revealed his accent. The police found him grateful to be captured, ready to return to camp, acknowledging that escape had been a mistake born of duty and stubbornness rather than genuine desire for freedom. All 25 escapees were eventually recaptured, none having made it more than 50 miles from camp. They were punished according to regulations: isolation, loss of privileges, extra work details. But even in punishment, even after deliberately violating the rules, they were treated according to law rather than whim. No beatings, no torture, no summary execution. Just consequences proportional to the offence, administered fairly and without cruelty. The escape attempt taught lessons to everyone involved. The prisoners learned that even escaped, America was still America, abundant, comfortable, and impossible to hate even when you were supposed to be enemies. The camp authorities learned that comfort didn't eliminate all desire to escape, that duty and honor could motivate men even when their circumstances were better than they'd ever experienced. Everyone learned that the Arizona desert doesn't care about your nationality or your cause. It will kill you efficiently and without malice if you don't respect it. Spring 1945 brought changes that rippled through every camp. The war in Europe was clearly ending. Germany was collapsing from both east and west, squeezed between Soviet and Allied advances, running out of soldiers and equipment and hope. The propaganda broadcasts that had sustained German morale for years rang increasingly hollow as reality contradicted every official statement. In the camps, letters from home stopped arriving. The postal system had broken down. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered or dead. The prisoners had no idea what awaited them when they eventually returned. Many feared the worst, imagining devastation so complete that Germany itself might cease to exist as a nation, becoming instead a wasteland fought over by victors who'd carved up the corpse of a dead empire. Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German cowboys that surprised no one who'd watched them work together. He wished they could stay. The ranch always needed good hands, and these Germans were the best he'd worked with in decades. He'd sponsor them if the law allowed, help them immigrate legally, pay them real wages as employees rather than prisoners. $100 per month plus room and board, more than they'd make anywhere in post-war Germany if Germany still existed in any recognizable form. But the Geneva Convention was crystal clear. Prisoners must be repatriated when hostilities end. No exceptions, no matter how useful they'd become or how much they wanted to stay. They had to go home, even when home was a concept rather than a place, an idea of a nation that might not survive the year. Ranchers and farmers across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona wrote to their congressmen, pleading for exceptions to the repatriation rules. These weren't just prisoners anymore. They'd become neighbors, friends, valuable workers who'd proven themselves over 2 years of labor. Losing them would hurt economically and personally. But the law was the law, written to protect prisoners from exploitation and forced retention, and it couldn't be changed even for good reasons. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In Camp Hearn, 500 prisoners gathered around radios in the recreation hall, listening to the announcement in numb silence. Their country was gone. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted exactly 12. Everything they'd fought for, everyone who'd died, all the sacrifices and suffering had led to this: total defeat and unconditional surrender. But something else had been born in these camps, on these ranches, in these churches and fields and kitchens. Understanding, friendship, a glimpse of a different future than the one promised by those who'd sent them to war. They'd seen American abundance and American generosity. They'd experienced American confidence, so complete that the nation could afford to be kind to its enemies. They'd learned that strength doesn't require cruelty, that power doesn't demand hatred, that enemies can become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives and shared meals. That night, John Davidson brought a bottle of bourbon to Camp Hearn, good pre-war whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. He shared it with Wilhelm Müller and the other Germans who'd worked his fields for 2 years, men who'd become more than employees, more than prisoners, something approaching friends despite the official designations that separated them. They drank to the end of the war, to the dead on all sides who'd never see peace, to whatever came next in a world permanently altered by 6 years of industrial slaughter. Müller told Davidson, through a translator who was barely needed anymore after 2 years of working together, that he wanted to come back someday, when the law allowed it, when Germany had recovered enough that leaving it didn't feel like abandonment, when he could return as an immigrant rather than a prisoner, choosing America rather than being forced into it by the fortunes of war. America had shown him something Germany never had, Müller explained, struggling for words adequate to the realization. Strength doesn't require cruelty. Power doesn't demand hatred. A nation can be mighty without being brutal. People can disagree about everything and still treat each other with basic human decency. These seemed like simple ideas, obvious even, but they contradicted everything he'd been taught since childhood. Every principle the regime had insisted was natural law. The repatriation began in 1946. Trains reversed their original journey, east to the ports, then ships across an Atlantic no longer contested by U-boats. Back to a destroyed continent, to a nation that existed in name only, to cities that were rubble fields punctuated by skeletal building remains. The Germany they returned to bore no resemblance to the one they'd left. The war had destroyed not just infrastructure, but society itself, grinding down civilization until only survival remained. But the Germans carried something with them beyond memories and saved wages. They carried knowledge, not military secrets or technical information, something more valuable and transformative. They knew how Americans worked. They'd seen American farming methods, American organizational principles, American attitudes toward work and efficiency and innovation. They'd absorbed lessons in productivity and management that hadn't existed in Germany, at least not at the scale Americans practiced. More importantly, they knew Americans. Not as the propaganda caricatures painted by the regime, not as the enemies demonized in posters and speeches, but as actual people encountered daily over 2 years of working together. They knew Thomas Anderson teaching them to ride horses. They knew Rosa Martinez ladling extra stew onto plates. They knew John Davidson shaking their hands as equals. They knew Pete Randolph sharing coffee with an escaped prisoner in an Arizona gas station. When they told these stories in Germany, no one believed them. Americans treating prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers? Impossible. Paying them wages? Absurd. Teaching them skills? Insanity. Sharing their churches and their food and their kindness? Fantasy. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 425,000 German POWs had worked American farms and ranches from 1943 to 1946. They'd harvested millions of dollars in crops, picked cotton by the ton, saved entire harvests that would have rotted without their labor. The American agricultural miracle that fed Allied armies and civilian populations had been partially sustained by enemy prisoners who'd expected barbarism and found abundance. By 1950, something remarkable happened. American immigration laws changed, modified by the reality of Cold War politics that made former German soldiers more valuable as potential allies than as perpetual enemies. Former prisoners of war were allowed to apply for immigration, subject to background checks and sponsorship requirements, eligible to return to America legally. 5,000 of them did. They boarded ships in Hamburg and Bremen and Wilhelmshaven, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants seeking opportunity in a nation they'd first encountered as enemies. They passed through Ellis Island and other entry points, answered questions from immigration officials who noted their unusual status, received the documentation that made them legal residents with paths to eventual citizenship. Werner Hartmann returned to Texas in 1951. John Davidson met him at the train station in Houston, same firm handshake but stronger now, grip tightening with genuine pleasure. No translator was needed. Werner's English was perfect, Texas accented, the linguistic mark of someone who'd spent years practicing and dreaming of return. He sounded like a cowboy because he was one, or would be again, as soon as he got back to the fields where he'd learned what America really meant. He married a local girl named Mary Sullivan, daughter of a teacher and a railroad worker, a woman who saw past his accent and his history to the man who'd proven himself through labor and character. They bought a small house outside Houston. Werner opened a machine shop, fixing tractors and farm equipment, applying the mechanical skills he'd learned in the Luftwaffe to civilian purposes. His business thrived because he was good at the work and fair in his prices, and people trusted him despite his origins. Their son attended Texas A&M, studied agricultural engineering, earned a degree that qualified him for work anywhere in the state. Their grandson served in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne U.S. Army, jumping out of perfectly good airplanes for reasons that seemed insane to his grandfather, but were motivated by the same sense of duty that had sent that grandfather to war 70 years earlier. The transformation was complete. The enemy had become family, the prisoner had become citizen, the German had become American in a way that transcended paperwork and ceremony. Erich Schmidt returned to Arizona in 1952. Thomas Anderson had work waiting for him, a permanent position with wages that made him middle class by American standards and wealthy by German ones. Schmidt proved his worth immediately, as if the intervening years had changed nothing, still the best horseman Anderson had ever trained. Within a decade, he'd saved enough to buy his own ranch, 500 acres near Tucson, land that had been desert before irrigation made it productive, now supporting cattle and horses and dreams. He raised quarter horses, breeding for speed and temperament, winning prizes at state fairs, earning a reputation that spread beyond Arizona. His neighbors knew his story. Most didn't care. In Arizona, especially in rural Arizona, you were judged by how you worked and how you treated your word. Character counted more than birthplace. A man who kept his promises and paid his debts was worth more than a native-born failure who did neither. Even some of the Papago Park escapees returned legally. Johann Kremer, who'd been found by Pete Randolph in that Phoenix gas station, came back in 1953. He opened a small business in Phoenix, not far from where he'd been recaptured, the irony lost on no one. He sold automotive parts, nothing glamorous but profitable, serving customers who eventually knew his history but valued his knowledge and fair dealing more than his past. Pete Randolph became a regular customer and then a friend, the relationship built on that strange encounter in 1944 that had started as capture and become something more human. Decades passed. The former POWs became old men, their war years receding into distant memory, increasingly incomprehensible to younger generations who'd grown up in peace and prosperity. But they never forgot their time in American captivity, those years that had transformed their understanding of the world and themselves. They returned periodically to the camps or to the sites where camps had been, bringing photo albums and memories to share with anyone interested in listening. At one reunion in Texas, held at what had been Camp Hearn, now returned to farmland, several hundred former prisoners gathered with their families. They were grandfathers now, grey and bent, speaking English with various accents, American citizens with German childhoods, living contradictions of the ideology that had sent them to war. An elderly rancher, son of John Davidson, stood to speak. His voice was weaker than his father's had been, but his message carried the same conviction. You boys came here as enemies. You left as friends. You came back as family. That's the American way. That's the cowboy way. That's the human way. We judge people by who they are and what they do, not where they're from or what uniform they wore. You proved yourselves in our fields and on our ranches. You earned your place here. We're grateful you chose to come back. The applause went on for 5 minutes, former enemies embracing, former prisoners crying openly, families mingling across national and historical lines that once seemed absolute. It wasn't healing exactly, because the wounds of war don't fully heal, but it was acknowledgement that humanity persists even through catastrophic violence, that redemption is possible even after terrible mistakes, that the future doesn't have to repeat the past. The numbers tell one version of the story: 425,000 German POWs held in America, 700 camps across 46 states, millions of dollars in agricultural labor, 5,000 eventually returning as immigrants. But statistics can't capture the transformations that occurred in individual hearts and minds, the slow dissolution of hatred under the persistent pressure of ordinary human kindness. Nazi soldiers became Texas cowboys. U-boat sailors became Arizona ranchers. Luftwaffe pilots became Midwestern farmers. Men who'd fought for an ideology built on cruelty and hierarchy discovered a nation built on different principles that were flawed and imperfect, but fundamentally different from what they'd known. Enemies became neighbors. Hatred dissolved in the acid of hospitality. Propaganda shattered against the rock of direct experience. The Germans had expected American barbarism because that's what they'd been told to expect. They found American abundance instead, not just material abundance, though there was plenty of that, but abundance of spirit, the confidence of a nation so secure that it could afford generosity toward enemies, the strength that permitted mercy, the power that didn't require cruelty to prove itself. America in 1943 was far from perfect, still struggling with racial inequality and economic injustice, still capable of terrible mistakes and moral failures. But it was different from Nazi Germany in ways that mattered, ways that German prisoners could observe directly and compare to their own experiences. In his final letter home from Camp McLean in 1946, written just before repatriation, one prisoner named Heinrich Bauer wrote to his mother in what remained of Hamburg, "The Americans are cowboys, just like the propaganda said. But they never told us cowboys could be kind. They never told us cowboys would share their food without being asked, teach their skills without demanding payment, shake hands like equals with men who'd fought against them. They never told us cowboys would treat us better than our own government treated us. They never told us the truth about anything. Everything we were told was lies, Mother. Everything. The Americans aren't perfect. They have their own problems and injustices. But they're not what we were taught to believe. They're just people, like us, trying to do their best. And their best includes treating even enemies with basic human dignity. I've learned more in these 3 years than in my entire life before. I've learned that enemies are just strangers you haven't worked beside yet. That hatred can't survive a harvest. That humanity is stronger than any uniform or ideology. I'm coming home, but part of me will always remain here, changed by what I've seen and experienced." They came as warriors of the Third Reich, convinced of their superiority and righteousness, prepared for the barbarism they'd been promised. They left as something else entirely, men who'd discovered that their enemies were human, and more importantly, that they themselves were human too, capable of change and growth and new understanding. In the dust of Texas cotton fields, the mesa shadows of New Mexico, the desert sun of Arizona, they learned the most dangerous lesson possible for any totalitarian ideology. That people are more alike than different, that kindness is more powerful than cruelty, that shared work and shared meals can dissolve differences that seem absolute from a distance. The story of German POWs in America isn't just history. It's a reminder that even in the midst of total war, humanity persists. That even between enemies, connection is possible. That people are never just the ideologies they're forced to serve, or the uniforms they're made to wear. The Germans who spent years in American captivity carried those lessons back to Germany, where they helped rebuild a nation from rubble, creating the democratic, prosperous Germany that eventually emerged from the ashes of defeat. And those who returned to America as immigrants helped prove that the American experiment in multi-ethnic democracy, for all its flaws and failures, offered something worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth calling home.